when emotional detachment becomes real, relationship dynamics begin to shift in ways that are often subtle but deeply powerful. Detachment is not about anger, punishment, or coldness. It is the quiet withdrawal of emotional dependency. Psychologically, people are highly attuned to changes in attention and availability. When someone who once invested energy, care, and responsiveness becomes calm, grounded, and self-contained, the contrast is felt immediately. Human connection is influenced by perceived value, and perceived value is closely tied to emotional investment. When you stop trying to convince, chase, or seek reassurance, you remove the familiar pattern that once defined the interaction. This creates cognitive dissonance, a psychological tension that arises when expectations no longer match reality. The other person begins to notice the absence of emotional cues they once relied on, and this awareness can prompt reflection. What changed? Why does this feel different? Why is the dynamic no longer predictable? Detachment also communicates self-respect without words. Instead of negotiating for attention or reacting to inconsistency, you demonstrate stability. This shift moves the relationship away from emotional reactivity and toward personal autonomy. People naturally respond to emotional certainty when someone stands firmly in their own worth. It alters how they are perceived and treated. Importantly, genuine detachment is not a strategy to provoke reaction. It is a byproduct of internal clarity. It happens when a person no longer measures their value through another's behavior. That inner shift changes tone, body language, and decision-making. Communication becomes calmer. Boundaries become clearer. Emotional responses become measured rather than urgent. This transformation often feels powerful because it restores balance within the individual first. When you are no longer trying to control the outcome of the relationship, you regain control of yourself. And paradoxically, this self-possession is what often reshapes the interaction most. The dynamic changes not because of what is said, but because of what is no longer needed. Value is rarely measured while it is constantly available. In close relationships, consistent presence can quietly become part of the emotional background, like something assumed rather than consciously appreciated. This is not always intentional neglect. It is a natural psychological tendency. The human mind is wired to adapt to stability, and once something feels guaranteed, attention shifts elsewhere. Only when that stability changes does awareness sharpen. Absence interrupts familiarity. When access to someone's time, energy, or emotional support is no longer certain, perception recalibrates. The mind begins to replay memories, reassess moments, and compare what was with what is. This process is driven by contrast. What once blended into routine now stands out because it is no longer present in the same way. Emotional significance often becomes clear when it is experienced through distance rather than proximity. Psychologically, uncertainty heightens focus. When people sense that something meaningful may be gone or cannot be regained, they become more attentive to its value. This does not mean absence creates worth. Rather, it reveals worth that was previously unnoticed or underestimated. The realization emerges not from manipulation but from perspective. Distance removes emotional noise and exposes the true impact of a person's presence. This shift also reflects a deeper principle of human connection. Appreciation grows when something is freely given, not endlessly pursued. When someone stops trying to prove their importance, their role is no longer defined by effort but by impact. The other person is left to evaluate what the relationship genuinely contributed to their life, independent of persuasion or reassurance. Importantly, recognition through absence is not about causing regret, it is about clarity. Both individuals are given space to see the relationship without dependency or expectation clouding perception. In that space, emotional truth becomes more visible. Whether the realization leads to growth, reconciliation, or acceptance, the awareness itself is valuable. It teaches that presence carries meaning beyond routine, and that genuine connection is understood most deeply when it is experienced as a choice rather than an assumption. Self-respect becomes the decisive turning point when a person stops negotiating their worth for emotional security. It is not a sudden act of defiance, but a gradual internal decision to align behavior with personal value. Psychologically, this shift marks the transition from external validation to internal stability. Instead of asking, "How am I being treated?" the focus becomes, "What standard do I choose to live by?" That change alone reshapes how one communicates, responds, and sets boundaries. When self-respect strengthens, emotional urgency begins to dissolve. There is less impulse to over-explain, to chase reassurance, or to tolerate inconsistency for the sake of connection. This does not come from indifference, but from clarity. The individual recognizes that acceptance cannot be forced and that dignity cannot coexist with persistent self-abandonment. As a result, decisions become calmer and more intentional. Silence replaces argument. Distance replaces pleading. Stability replaces reaction. This internal shift often alters the power balance, but not in a controlling sense. True power here is not dominance over another person, it is mastery over one's own responses. When someone no longer fears losing approval, they become less influenced by emotional pressure. Others can sense this composure. Boundaries feel firmer, words carry more weight, and behavior becomes consistent rather than reactive. Respect in many cases follows clarity. Self-respect also restores personal responsibility. Instead of waiting for change from the outside, a person begins to ask what environment supports their well-being and what patterns they no longer wish to participate in. This perspective transforms relationships from places of emotional survival into spaces of mutual choice. Connection is no longer maintained out of fear of loss, but out of genuine alignment. Importantly, choosing self-respect does not guarantee a specific outcome in a relationship. What it guarantees is personal coherence, the experience of acting in harmony with one's values. That coherence strengthens confidence, reduces emotional confusion, and fosters resilience. The turning point is not the reaction it produces in others, but the peace it establishes within. When dignity becomes non-negotiable, self-worth stops fluctuating with circumstance, and growth becomes inevitable. Emotional loss, while painful, often becomes one of the most powerful catalysts for personal growth. When a meaningful connection changes or ends, it disrupts familiar emotional patterns and forces reflection that comfort rarely invites. Instead of moving automatically through routines, a person is compelled to examine their needs, boundaries, expectations, and sense of identity. This period of disruption, though uncomfortable, creates the psychological space where transformation becomes possible. Growth begins when attention shifts from what was lost to what can be learned. Emotional separation reveals patterns that may have gone unnoticed where effort was uneven, where communication broke down, or where self-worth was tied too tightly to another's approval. Awareness of these patterns is not about blame, it is about understanding. Insight allows individuals to recognize what they contributed, what they tolerated, and what they truly require for a healthy connection moving forward. Loss also strengthens emotional independence. When a person learns to regulate their feelings without relying on constant reassurance, resilience develops naturally. They discover that stability can exist even in uncertainty, and that identity is not defined by a single relationship. This realization reduces fear and increases confidence in future connections. Rather than seeking completion through another person, they begin to approach relationships as partnerships between two whole individuals. Importantly, growth through loss refines values. Experiences that once felt acceptable may no longer align with a clearer sense of self. Standards evolve. Boundaries become intentional rather than reactive. The individual becomes more selective, not out of defensiveness, but out of wisdom. They understand that meaningful connection is built on mutual respect, emotional consistency, and shared intention. Whether reconciliation occurs or paths permanently diverge, the deeper outcome remains personal evolution. Pain transforms into perspective, and perspective transforms into strength. The experience teaches that endings are not solely conclusions. They are transitions that redirect energy towards self-development. When someone uses loss as a mirror rather than a verdict, they emerge with greater clarity, maturity, and emotional depth, qualities that enrich every future relationship, and most importantly, their relationship with themselves. Together, these ideas reveal a central truth about human connection. The most profound shifts in relationships begin within the individual. When emotional detachment replaces dependency, when absence clarifies value, when self-respect guides behavior, and when loss is embraced as a teacher, the focus moves from controlling outcomes to cultivating personal strength. What changes externally is often a reflection of what has already transformed internally. Relationships are not sustained by pursuit alone, but by mutual recognition, presence, and respect. When a person becomes grounded in their own worth, they no longer seek validation to feel complete. Instead, they participate in connection from a place of choice rather than need. This perspective reduces emotional turbulence and invites more authentic interactions, whether reconciliation occurs or paths separate. Ultimately, the greatest outcome is not the reaction of another person, but the evolution of the self. Clarity replaces confusion, dignity replaces uncertainty, and growth replaces attachment to what cannot be controlled. Through these shifts, relationships, past or future, are approached with greater wisdom, balance, and emotional maturity. The true power lies not in being valued by someone else, but in becoming someone who fully